In the first years of the 19th century, when England measured a soul by lineage as readily as it weighed gold, Ashbourne Estate woke each morning to the quiet tyranny of order. Bells marked the hours, servants moved like shadows, and above them all stood the Duke of Ashbourne, 24 years of age, faultlessly composed, and already spoken of in drawing rooms as a man carved from winter. Grief had taught him discipline early. The recent deaths of his parents left him master of vast lands and lonelier than any tenant who labored upon them. He governed his house with courtesy sharpened into distance, believing affection a weakness best kept under lock and key. Delphine entered this world not with ambition but with necessity. At 20, she served as lady's maid, her posture refined by a childhood once gentler than her present allowed. Her family, émigrés undone by revolution and exile, had lost title, fortune, and country, leaving her only dignity as inheritance. She wore service like a veil, concealing sorrow behind obedience, beauty behind restraint. Among the servants, she was admired quietly, for she spoke little and listened deeply, her eyes holding thoughts she never voiced aloud. The first wound was given without intention. One afternoon, in the presence of footmen and a visiting cousin, the Duke dismissed a jest regarding marriage with a voice devoid of warmth. "I shall never love a servant," he said, as one might declare the weather unchangeable. The sentence passed through the hall like a draught through an open door, chilling those who heard it. Delphine stood still, her hands folded, her expression unmoved, yet the words settled within her with merciless clarity. They were not spoken to her, yet they named her place with finality. Gossip travels swiftly where silence reigns. By evening, the phrase had been reshaped and whispered along the servants' corridor, acquiring edges sharper than the Duke had intended. Delphine heard it repeated as truth, as warning, as reminder. She answered no one. That night, alone in her narrow room, she pressed her palm to her chest and mastered her breath, not from romantic hope dashed, but from the older ache of knowing herself unseen. Duty, however, is indifferent to wounded pride. Days later, when the Duke returned from inspecting the grounds with his hand cut by a broken latch, it was Delphine who was summoned. She cleaned the wound with practiced care, her fingers steady, her gaze lowered. The fire burned softly, rain tapped against the windows. He thanked her, briefly, formally, then dismissed her as if nothing more had passed between them than necessity. Yet something lingered, unacknowledged, in the careful way she bound the cloth and in the silence he allowed to stretch before she left. The moment that followed would later be remembered as small, though it altered much. Delphine paused at the threshold to offer a quiet suggestion for the pain, learned from her mother long ago. The Duke, weary and unguarded, replied too sharply, calling her kindness presumption. The word struck with precision. Delphine's composure faltered, tears gathered, not from humiliation alone, but from recognition of his loneliness, which mirrored her own too closely. She bowed, withdrew, and was gone before he could reconsider. Left alone, the Duke felt an unfamiliar unrest. He told himself it was irritation, that servants must know their place, that sympathy invited disorder. Yet her expression followed him through the evening, haunting his thoughts with its gentleness and restraint. In the quiet of his study, surrounded by portraits of ancestors who had chosen pride over tenderness, he wondered, uneasily, whether he had mistaken strength for cruelty. Beyond his door, Delphine packed nothing, said nothing, and prepared herself, as she always had, to endure. Yet endurance had limits she scarcely admitted. Before sleep claimed her, Delphine learned that her position might soon be reassigned, her presence deemed inconvenient to harmony above stairs. The knowledge settled heavily, though she accepted it with the resignation of one accustomed to quiet losses. Tomorrow would require composure. Tonight allowed a single tear to fall upon her folded gloves. Somewhere across the estate, the Duke stood at his window, watching lamplight fade from servants' quarters, unsettled by the sense that something fragile had been damaged beyond easy repair. Neither spoke of departure, Yet both felt its approach, like a distant carriage heard long before it arrived, carrying consequences neither rank nor obedience could wholly prevent. It was there, in that shared silence, that the first thread of change tightened unseen, promising sorrow before solace, and binding two lives already trembling toward a reckoning neither yet dared to name. Thus the house slept, unaware that its careful order had begun, quietly and irrevocably, to break. None of them could yet imagine what love would demand. Morning returned to Ashbourne with deceptive calm, as though the house itself wished to deny the quiet fracture that had begun within its walls. The Duke resumed his routines with practiced precision, issuing instructions, reviewing accounts, and answering correspondence with the same immaculate restraint that had long defined him. Yet his attention faltered in small, unfamiliar ways. He found himself listening for lighter footsteps in the corridor, noticing absences where once he had been content with silence. Delphine, for her part, performed her duties with unwavering exactness, neither avoiding nor seeking him, guarding her composure as one might protect a dwindling flame from careless air. Their encounters became charged by what remained unsaid. When she delivered linens or tended the sitting room, the Duke observed her from the corner of his vision, struck by the contrast between her modest station and the quiet authority with which she moved. She did not fawn, nor did she retreat into invisibility. Her restraint carried weight, suggesting a will disciplined not by fear alone, but by principle. This unsettled him more than open defiance ever could, for it suggested a strength he had never accounted for in those who served. One evening, as dusk softened the edges of the estate, Delphine discovered a slim volume resting beside the tray of polished silver she was meant to collect. It was a book of verse, worn at the spine, its margins marked with careful notes. No name accompanied it, yet she recognized it at once as belonging to the Duke, having seen it once in his study. She hesitated, then closed it gently, understanding the offering for what it was, not a command, not an apology, but an invitation to be seen. She returned the book the following morning, placing it precisely where it had been found, a ribbon of blue silk folded between its pages in silent acknowledgement. Such gestures, though small, do not remain unseen in a house trained to observe. Whispers resumed, sharper now, tinged with speculation. A lady visiting from a neighboring estate noted Delphine's presence with narrowed eyes, remarking upon familiarity where none was openly displayed. The Duke heard of it secondhand and felt an unexpected surge of anger, not at the insinuation itself, but the vulnerability it exposed. Reputation, once breached, rarely healed without cost, and he knew too well who would be made to pay. Delphine sensed the shift before any word reached her. Courtesy toward her grew strained among the staff, glances lingering too long, kindness turning brittle. She met it with dignity, refusing complaint, yet the weight pressed heavily. She had lived too long at the mercy of circumstance to mistake warning signs for coincidence. That night, she wrote a brief notice requesting reassignment at the end of the month, choosing departure over the slow erosion of her name. The ink trembled only once as she signed it. The Duke learned of her decision by accident, overhearing a steward mention the impending vacancy. The knowledge struck him with unexpected force. He spent the afternoon in restless movement, unable to settle, recalling the careful placement of the ribbon, the steadiness of her hands, the tears she had so quickly mastered. He told himself that this was the natural order restored, that distance would correct imbalance. Yet the thought of her absence hollowed the house in ways he could not dismiss. That evening, he summoned her under the pretense of routine. When she entered, her expression was composed, though her eyes carried resolve rather than submission. He thanked her for her service, formally, then paused, the words he intended refusing to form. She spoke instead, her voice calm, informing him of her request to leave, assuring him it was of her own choosing. There was no accusation in her tone, only finality. The Duke inclined his head, granting permission as duty required. As she turned to go, something in him rebelled against the simplicity of the moment. He almost spoke her name, almost reached for an authority that had never failed him before. But habit prevailed, and silence claimed the space between them. Delphine departed with measured steps, her decision made, her dignity intact. Alone once more, the Duke stood amid the fading light, aware that he had allowed something irreplaceable to slip beyond reach. The house seemed altered, its vastness suddenly oppressive. Outside, the grounds lay quiet, waiting. Delphine began to count the days, not with hope, but with the steady courage of one who had learned to survive departure. Neither yet understood that separation, once chosen, rarely remains a simple thing, and that restraint, stretched too far, has a way of demanding reckoning. Rain gathered over Ashbourne on the evening Delphine was to depart, darkening the sky and muting the estate into a hush that felt expectant rather than calm. The carriage waited beyond the gates, its lamps lit, its presence a quiet declaration that choices once made could not be unmade. Delphine moved through the house one final time, her belongings reduced to a single case, her bearing composed, though every step carried the weight of relinquishment. She did not seek farewell, believing dignity resided in leaving without spectacle. The Duke learned of her imminent departure only when he saw the carriage through his study window. The sight unsettled him with an urgency he could no longer deny. He crossed the hall without summoning a servant, his measured composure breaking into haste for the first time in years. When he found Delphine in the entryway, cloaked and waiting, the restraint that had governed him faltered beneath the realization that silence would now become permanent. He spoke her name, quietly, as though testing its right to exist beyond thought. Delphine turned, surprise briefly softening her resolve, before propriety returned her expression to calm attentiveness. The rain intensified, echoing against the stone, enclosing them in a moment neither had anticipated. He asked her to remain, not as an order, but as a request stripped of authority. The humility in his voice startled them both. Delphine answered with care, reminding him that remaining would invite speculation neither could control. She spoke of her name, fragile yet fiercely guarded, of the cost women paid for whispers men survived unmarked. Her words were not reproach, but truth, and they pierced him more deeply than accusation could have done. He listened, truly listened, and in doing so felt the foundations of his certainty begin to erode. At last he confessed what pride had long forbidden. He spoke of solitude disguised as duty, of grief misnamed as discipline, of affection withheld until it hardened into fear. Loving her, he admitted, terrified him not because she was a servant, but because she saw him without reverence and remained kind. His voice faltered only once, when he acknowledged the cruelty he had shown her and the shame it had since awakened. Delphine's composure broke then, not in a protest, but into tears she did not attempt to hide. They fell quietly, carrying sorrow rather than hope, for she knew confession did not promise protection. She told him she believed his sincerity, yet sincerity could not shield her from consequence. If she stayed, she would be diminished, defined by rumor rather than merit. Loving him, she realized, would demand more courage than leaving ever could. The Duke felt the truth of her words settle heavily upon him. He could not ask her to sacrifice herself upon the altar of his awakening. Yet the thought of her absence felt unbearable, a future stripped of warmth he had only just begun to recognize. In that moment, he understood that love, if it meant anything at all, required choice sharpened into action. He told her he would not command, nor conceal, nor allow her to bear disgrace alone. If she remained, it would be with his name openly beside hers, or not at all. The declaration was not yet a proposal, but it carried the weight of irrevocable intent. Delphine searched his face, seeing not a duke asserting power, but a man offering risk. The carriage lamps flickered in the rain as silence stretched between them. Delphine closed her eyes briefly, steadying herself against the magnitude of what he offered. She did not accept, nor did she refuse. Instead, she asked him, softly, what place he imagined for her in a world that had already judged them both. The question lingered unanswered as the rain continued to fall, marking the moment as one from which neither could retreat unchanged. He knew no answer could be fashioned in haste, yet the asking bound him more tightly than any vow. The world beyond the gates waited with its judgments prepared, but within that narrow space, possibility stirred, fragile and dangerous. Delphine drew her cloak closer, signaling the hour's end, while the Duke remained rooted, aware that delay itself had become a choice. She stepped toward the door, not fleeing, but granting him the burden of decision. As her hand touched the latch, he spoke again, not with certainty, but with resolve born of fear transformed into courage. He asked her to grant him time, and she, after a measured pause, inclined her head. It was neither promise nor surrender, yet altered everything. The carriage did not depart that night, and Ashbourne, unsettled and watchful, held its breath. Somewhere between duty and desire, the future waited, irrevocable, patient, and near, listening as two lives balanced upon one choice. The days that followed unfolded with deliberate consequence, as though Ashbourne itself had sensed the gravity of the Duke's resolve. He did not retreat in his silence as before, nor did he cloak his intentions in ambiguity. Instead, he acted with a steadiness that surprised those who had long known him as distant rather than decisive. Invitations were declined, alliances postponed, and when questioned, he offered no explanation beyond a calm assertion of personal choice. In a society that prized conformity, such restraint spoke louder than rebellion. Delphine remained, not as a supplicant waiting upon favor, but as a woman observing whether words might at last be matched by courage. She performed her duties while preparing herself for either outcome, unwilling to surrender her dignity to hope alone. The Duke sought her company only when propriety allowed, their conversations measured yet unmistakably altered. He listened now, with intention rather than tolerance, and in doing so revealed a man reshaping himself against long habit. The reckoning arrived not in privacy, but before those whose opinions had once governed him. At a formal gathering convened to discuss his future, the Duke refused a proposed match of advantage, his tone unyielding yet devoid of apology. When pressed, he named Delphine plainly, neither elevating nor diminishing her, but insisting upon her worth with an honesty that unsettled the room. The declaration was met with silence, then disapproval, yet he did not waver. Rank, he asserted, could not substitute for regard, nor lineage excuse cruelty. Delphine learned of this choice not through rumor, but from the Duke himself. He told her without embellishment, acknowledging the cost his decision would exact from them both. He did not promise ease, only partnership, not protection, but equality in resolve. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine a future not defined by retreat. She accepted, not as an act of gratitude, but of trust earned through action. Their marriage was arranged quietly, resisting spectacle without apology. On the morning they wed, the countryside lay still, the church modest, its stones weathered by centuries of vows spoken in hope rather than certainty. Delphine entered without ornament beyond simplicity, her expression composed, her eyes clear. The Duke waited without impatience, his bearing transformed not by triumph, but by humility embraced. Whispers accompanied the ceremony, as they had all along, yet they held no power here. When vows were exchanged, they were spoken plainly, each word deliberate, each promise freely given. In that moment, the divisions that had once defined them receded, replaced by a shared resolve to endure consequence together. The Duke did not claim her as defiance, nor did she accept him as escape. They stood as equals, bound by choice rather than circumstance. Life did not soften overnight, nor did society relent entirely. Yet within Ashbourne, change took root. The house grew warmer, not in luxury, but in spirit, its order guided by regard rather than distance. Delphine moved through it without fear, her presence acknowledged, her voice respected. The Duke learned, gradually, That authority tempered by compassion did not diminish him, but clarified his purpose. Seasons turned, and with them came measured acceptance, not granted freely, but earned through constancy. The Duke endured censure without resentment, answering criticism with composure, allowing time to dull outrage into weary tolerance. Delphine faced scrutiny with quiet fortitude, refusing either defiance or apology, letting her conduct speak where defense would have failed. Together, they learned the labor of mutual regard, discovering that love required patience equal to passion. Each small kindness exchanged, each decision made in concert, reinforced what vows alone could not secure. Though doors closed elsewhere, within their shared life new rooms opened, filled not with indulgence, but with understanding, where respect grew steady, unassuming, and resilient. It was in these unremarked days that affection deepened, proving itself not spectacle, but steadfast presence, resilient against memory, judgment, and the erosion of doubt. In quiet evenings, they spoke of loss and survival, of the paths that had led them together, and of the future they would shape with care rather than haste. Love did not erase the world's harshness, but it offered shelter against it, a shared strength forged through trial. Ashbourne endured, not as monument to rank, but as testament to courage chosen over comfort. And so the Duke, who once declared himself incapable of loving a servant, learned that love, ungoverned by fear, transforms both giver and given. Delphine, who had learned to endure invisibility, stood seen at last, not elevated by title, but by regard freely bestowed. Their story did not end with triumph, but with continuity, a life lived forward in quiet defiance of expectation. In choosing one another, they altered not the world entire, but the small, enduring corner of it entrusted to their care.